Hi, my name is Josh Borges, and I'll be presenting the topic Exploiting a Thermal Side Channel for Power Attacks in Multi-Tenant Data Centers. I'd like to acknowledge the authors Mohammed Islam, Shaolai Ren, and Adam Wehrman. This paper was originally presented in 2017 at the ACM Conference on Computer and Communication Security in Dallas, Texas. The link is also provided to the original paper. The presentation will provide an overview of the types of data centers discussed in this paper and which of those data centers are more vulnerable to a thermal side channel attack. I'll describe what a power attack is and how a power attack can be used as a result of exploiting a thermal side channel. I'll also talk about the attack strategy used, the methods of defense, and the best defense method, and the experimental evaluations the authors concluded as part of their research. The goal of the presentation is to show that thermal side channels exist and that one can use a Kalman filter to estimate when to initiate a power attack. There are two main types of data centers: dedicated data centers and multi-tenant data centers. Dedicated data centers are facilities dedicated to a single business or customer. These facilities are not shared. These types of facilities manage power and cooling for efficiency purposes. Whereas multi-tenant data centers are facilities where more than one business or customer has their equipment. Each business or tenant has their equipment co-located with other tenants within the same floor or even the same rack. The equipment is not physically sectioned off from other equipment. Power is usually limited to about 80% of the maximum per tenant load to reduce the possibility of a power emergency. But the power within the data center as a whole is usually oversubscribed to 120%. This is to maximize revenue. This is possible because most servers in the data center are not running at full capacity, thus are not using their maximum allotted power. Power oversubscription is common and is a powerful tool for increasing utilization and revenue while reducing capital costs. But the drawback is there can potentially create dangerous infrastructure vulnerabilities. The types of data centers discussed in this paper are Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, and Tier 4 data centers. Tier 1 data centers have no power redundancy, and their power is provisioned to equal their total power capacity. So if any of the power units fail, availability is disrupted and there will be an outage in this data center. Tier 2 and Tier 3 data centers are built to an N+1 redundancy model, meaning there's one redundant backup to support the other N number of nodes within this facility. If any of the nodes are down, the facility looks like a Tier 1 data center because there's no backup at that point. Tier 4 data centers are built to a more robust 2N redundancy model. This means that each unit in the facility has a backup. To disrupt availability in these data centers, one must disable both the main and the backup power. This is much harder to do in a Tier 4 data center. This image illustrates a Tier 4 multi-tenant scenario with a malicious tenant. The malicious tenant rents space and has hardware alongside of the other benign tenants. The image also illustrates the fully redundant power system implemented in Tier 4 data centers. As you can see from the black and gray lines, there are two generators connected to the ATS for the incoming power. There's a set of UPS set up and multiple PDUs set up per rack. As you can see, each rack has multiple power supplies going into each server. So if one power supply is down, the other power supply is there to back it up. If entire UPS goes down, the other UPS will come online and kick in. Same for the generators. But not all data centers follow the same redundancy as was mentioned in the previous slide. And redundancy protection is actually lost during power emergencies, which is extremely dangerous and can increase an outage by over 280 times compared to when fully redundant. Now let's talk about the thermal side channel. Before I get to what a thermal side channel is, I think we should talk about what a power emergency is. Now, a power emergency is when the designed power capacity of a data center is overloaded. Now, many things can cause this, but in this case, we're looking at multiple tenants peaking at the same time. So if the peak power load is big enough and it lasts for a long enough period of time, circuits will start failing, creating outages in the data center. Now, outages can be very costly. One example cited in this paper is for Delta Airlines. Delta incurred approximately $150 million loss due to a 5-hour power outage. They're looking at roughly $30 million an hour because of a data center outage, and that's huge. Now let's talk about what a thermal side channel is. Now if you think about racks of servers and all of the heat generated by those servers, all of that heat exits into the rear of the server, creating a mass of hot air. Now, when that heat is recirculated within the data center, the heat can travel to other servers around it, as well as air intakes that take in hot air, cool it down, and send it back out into the data center. This is what is actually creating the thermal side channel. If you look at the bottom figure in the slide, labeled 1 and 2, that's your thermal side channel there. That's heat exiting from the servers, traveling around the data center into other areas. Those other areas can be measured for an increase in heat. Increases in heat correlate to increases of power. Now, if we look at the top image, the two circled data center racks represent server loads that have been increased to abnormal conditions, where the sensors 1 and 2 detect an increase in heat a mere 10 seconds after the load increase in the servers. So you can see with CFD modeling, the heat, an increase in power correlates to an increase in heat, which can be modeled within the data center. The scenario we have accounted for is for the attack on an oversubscribed multi-tenant data center that houses a malicious tenant. And that tenant can launch power attacks. Now, what can the attacker do, and what does the attacker know? The attacker knows the power capacity of the data center. This is common knowledge when a customer subscribes to a data center. They learn what the data center's capacity is. The attacker can subscribe to a certain amount of power capacity under its contract, the attacker can launch malicious power loads and attack almost instantaneously when an opportunity arises. The attacker has concealed temperature sensors in its servers at its server inlet to measure the incoming air temperature from the data center surroundings. The attacker can also perform computational fluid dynamics analysis based on the data it's receiving in its servers. Now, what can the attacker not do in this scenario? The attacker cannot hide destructive weapons inside the server for attack purposes, and this attacker cannot modify its off-the-shelf hardware to generate power spikes immediately blowing the circuit breakers. And the attacker cannot tamper with the data center infrastructure. The attack strategy has multiple steps. First, the attacker must embed temperature sensors, as discussed in the previous slide, within their servers that are going to be placed within the data center. Second, the attacker must log all of that data to be used within the Kalman filter. The attacker must be able to estimate the benign tenant's power from a thermal side channel. This is a very complex process with complex tasks that we can delve into later, but most importantly is the design and creation of the Kalman filter and the finite state machine, which is the framework for what the tenant is running the attack against. The image illustrates how the attacker needs to split the data center into virtual zones to limit its heat modeling to specific areas and not the entire data center as a whole. Now, what is a Kalman filter? The Kalman filter is essentially an algorithm that uses a series of measurements. These measurements are observed over a period of time. All the measurements contain statistical noise and other inaccurate measurements based on the surroundings. The filter produces estimates of unknown variables. These estimates tend to be more accurate than those based on a single measurement alone. This is done by estimating a joint probability distribution over the variables for each time frame. In this case, the unknown variable we're looking for is power consumption. Now, how is the Kalman filter used in this experiment? Well, the current temperature reading is affected by the server's power usage over the past X number of time slots. Now, the readings are based on the sensors in the attacker's servers. Now, the attacker needs a process model to characterize the dynamics of the other tenant's power usage over time. For simplicity, the attacker assumes that the tenant's server power is driven by a noisy process. Random noise is also injected into the process, creating the model. The thermal side channel is fully characterized by combining the observation model and the process model. The model has shown results of approximately 3% error on average, but a 54% identification of attack opportunities. Now for the attack. The attack strategy is simple. When the benign power estimate is higher than the trigger threshold, we'll initiate a power attack with maximum power for a fixed amount of time. Once the attack has completed, the attack process will hold and go idle for a set amount of time. Now, there are two important variables in this attack. First is the trigger threshold, which is PTH, the smaller the threshold is, the more times it will be triggered. This is because the power level will raise to the lower threshold, thus triggering an attack. If we raise the threshold higher, we'll reach that threshold fewer amount of times, thus initiating fewer attacks. This is important because the more attacks that are initiated, the higher the odds are of being detected by the data center, thus being evicted. A second consideration is the mandatory time between attacks, which is signified by T sub hold. The lower the value is, the more attacks can be triggered within an amount of time. For example, if T hold is 10 minutes, the process will hold or sleep for 10 minutes after an attack before it's able to go to an idle state and wait for another trigger. True positive and precision rates. As the attacker cannot launch attacks too frequently, true positives and precision rates are important metrics. True positive rate is defined as the percentage of available attack opportunities captured by the attacker, while the precision is the percentage of successful attacks among all the launched attacks. So it's attacks identified versus successful attacks. And we'll consider an attack successful if the designed power capacity is overloaded for at least 5 minutes. To illustrate what would happen if attacks had been launched based on the strategy in this paper, let's look at the power trace at the bottom of the slide. We see some successful attack points shown as, or labeled as 1, that can create prolonged overloads of the shared capacity. Now, an actual outage may not always occur after the overloaded capacity, but these show the best times to create an attack. There are also unsuccessful attacks, which are labeled as 2 due to overestimates of the benign tenant's power demand, and the increase in the attack load fails to overload the design capacity because of that underestimated power demand. It also shows missed opportunities. For example, around hour 19, there's an estimated high demand of power, but an attack has not been performed. So this is a missed opportunity for the attacker to overload the power system and create an outage. So there are several defenses to a thermal side channel power attack. The first is to randomize the supply air temperature. So you would randomize, do you want it at 60, 61, 62, 58, 59? You would do that in a random pattern, right? Adjusting the temperature of the air coming out of the cold air unit. Supply air temperature is actually an important parameter for the attacker's observation model, and its randomized effect could possibly confuse the attacker because it adjusts the temperature within the data center, right? The attacker, though, can easily set a parameter as a new state to estimate, along with the states of the benign tenant's power consumption within the Kalman filter. And if this is done, the estimate is pretty accurate once the new filter is derived, right? So randomizing your air supply temperature doesn't really offer very good protection against the attacker knowing or estimating when to initiate an attack. In fact, it could even have worse well, not really worse effects, but it can have negative effects on the cooling efficiency as you raise the temperature in the data center. You start to lose some of the efficiency of creating the cold air and pushing it through the servers. Another defense mechanism would be to randomize the supply flow. We talked about randomizing the temperature of the flow, but this is randomizing the supply flow, or when and where cold air is being supplied through the tile floor. Now, randomizing the supply airflow can make an attacker's knowledge of the heat recirculation more erroneous, right? So if they've already done their model on the heat recirculation, this would throw it off a bit. But this requires the data center operators to install special adaptive vent tiles that can be adjusted dynamically. But you also have to take into account when and where you place these tiles, because server heat reduction is important. So you want to make sure your servers are getting adequate amount of cold air so you don't overheat them. This is a pretty complex maintenance task, and it's not done in many data centers. And the fact that the attacker is looking for the aggregate of the entire zone, virtual zone, it doesn't really prevent them from sectioning off these zones and estimating when to do the attack. It's somewhat effective, but not fully effective. And the Kalman filter can be adjusted for all of these parameters, and in the end, it still performs reasonably well. The other defense mechanism is heat containment. So heat containment would decrease heat recirculation significantly by sealing both the cold air and the hot air aisles. So you'd have the cold air remaining in the back or the front of the servers to draw in, and the hot air existing only on the egress of the servers, and it would remain in that area until it's taken into the cold air units, right? So the hot air and the cold air are sectioned off. This almost completely eliminates any heat recirculation creating thermal side channels because they're completely separated. This is actually the best defense strategy because of the amount of heat recirculation is decreased through this process. And after the initial cost of sectioning off those areas, there's little to no maintenance to run this preventative service, I guess. So in conclusion, thermal side channels are real, but would be more successful in data centers of tier 1 to tier 3 due to their lack of redundancy or low redundancy. If an attacker is successful, an attack can actually result in tens of millions of dollars, as I pointed out with the Delta Airlines example. The best defense to prevent thermal side channel power attacks is to implement heat containment strategy in your data center. Just basically sectioning off the hot and cold aisles in the data center to prevent heat recirculation. Thank you.